Welcome to Construction Administration in Revit. My name is Jason Jones. I'm an architect with Gensler. And I have a couple years cumulatively construction administration experience using Revit, and then a couple years using AutoCAD. During the last several years, the projects I've been involved in have been medium-sized interiors projects that were pretty complicated. So they were small enough that I was the primary architectural contact, but they were not so large that I wasn't doing my own documentation. Also, during this time, I was managing standards for a global account for a client who did about 25 projects with us, and I was also doing quality control on those projects. 6 of them were built domestically, so I was working closely with the project teams that were going through the CA process there, and that gave me the opportunity to kind of treat that as a test bed for CA practices. Also, working at Gensler has given me the opportunity to speak to a bunch of different types of, people on different types of projects. I spoke to teams working on a terminal renovation at the San Francisco airport, a baggage upgrade at John Wayne Airport, interiors projects for Apple and for Nokia, and talking to all those people, I found that it seemed like everybody was trying to do essentially the same thing, but they were doing it in a lot of different ways. So I don't think in this lecture I'm going to be able to tell you this is exactly the way you should be able to do it, but possibly you'll see some things that you can take away from this that will be helpful. So as noted in the class summary, I'll be speaking about using Revit while engaged in construction administration. I'll be covering some of the best practices and methods for creating some of the documentation involved in communicating between architect and contractor. Primarily, I'm going to be talking about out-of-the-box Revit tools, but I'll also explore some techniques that depart from those standard tools, mostly having to do with tracking specific revision issues or revision items within issues. And I'll also discuss some of the pros and cons for many of the techniques that I'm showing here, because not every project is going to be the same, and I will make some recommendations, and I might be kind of biased towards some techniques over some others, but by giving you some pros and cons, you can kind of decide for yourself whether or not it might make sense to do something one way versus another. I'd also like to note that this lecture is geared towards an intermediate audience, but I'll be starting out with some kind of basic stuff just to give some context before moving on to some things that are a little more complicated. So by the end of this class, you should be able to understand Revit's basic built-in revision tracking tools. You should be able to track sheet revisions with a revision schedule. You'll be able to create sketches in different formats with different methods. You should be able to create a system for item-based revision tracking and create a per-sheet item revision log. And a lot of these things will probably make more sense when I start showing examples. So what documentation are we talking about when we're talking about documentation used in communicating between all the interested parties involved in construction administration? Tracking milestones of issuance. An example of that is just that you may need a list of when documents were issued. An example would be a sheet index that maybe has a date that shows the current issue. Documenting a list, sorry, getting off topic here, graphically distinguishing revisions, basically clouds, so you can tell what was revised. Providing a graphic history of individual revisions, that is usually revision tags. I'm going to skip the cost item there. I'll come back to that later. Documenting a list of sheets issued at each milestone. An example of this would be a revision matrix. You might use that on a larger project where you want to see every sheet and at what milestone it was issued. Issuance of revisions in various formats. So that might be issuing a sketch in a letter or tabloid format. Tracking descriptions of individual revisions, both for your kind of internal organization and to help provide you with a revision narrative. And then scheduling of individual revisions on sheets. So based on the size of the project and what your local regulatory agencies are requiring and the practices that are typical in your office, you may do some of these things or you may do all of these things. So basic revision tracking functionality. I'm going to talk first about the revision settings within Revit. And Revit's, one of its main advantages is the centralized nature of the data, where you can enter data in one place and everything within the model has access to it. It's going to help ensure that the document set is coordinated. So, in keeping that with that idea, Revit has a central location for managing revision settings. So I probably put too much information in this slide. This is kind of the basic stuff, so I'm just putting it all up there, and I'm going to jump into the model now and go through it kind of quickly. So this always tends to happen. The monitor gets resized when you go to a projection screen. So forgive me, I'm going to use keyboard shortcuts a lot in here. But the revision settings are within the View tab. Oh, there it is. And when you open this up, you have here a centralized location to track all of your milestones and revisions. The first area here is the sequence, and when you have a revision schedule on a sheet, the sequence is usually what you're going to be sorting by to determine the order that the revisions show up on the sheet. Although you can sort by date or description, it's hard to think of when that would be applicable. For numbering here, you have three options. You can have issues that are not numbered. So that would be typically for issues that are prior to issuing for a permit. You can number alphabetically or numerically. And there are a lot of different ways that you could structure this. I've found that if you're going through a process with the design, bid, build, and you're going through in sequence, which doesn't always happen, but if you are doing that, then it makes a lot of sense to start alphabetically when you do your first response to plan check comments, because that's going to be the first point at which you want to start clouding and keeping track of what has changed, and then switch over to numeric numbering once the contract has been awarded to the contractor. And the reason I like to do that is because at Gensler, with our particular standards, we have one bulletin form that addresses items that affect cost or items that require a contractor to submit a proposal. But everything is basically a bulletin. So if you start numbering once the contract is issued, then your bulletin numbers will correspond to the numbering sequence. So if you have a triangle 1, it's going to be bulletin 1. But of course you may run into different situations, especially if you issue for permit and you start making comment responses, and then the client wants to take the job out to bid, and then you're doing addenda while you're responding to plan check comments, and then it gets a lot more complicated. So date and description are relatively straightforward. This issued checkbox here, when you check that, the intent is that you check that once you have issued, and it basically locks down the clouds and the tags that you've placed and doesn't allow you to change them. But you can always come back in here and uncheck that box. Issued to and issued by, pretty self-explanatory. If your particular office standards don't make use of who you're issuing to or who is issuing it, then you can certainly use these for other purposes. We actually typically show who issued it and then who checked it, so we just rename the title of one of these in our revision schedule. The show column here determines what is going to be shown if you've clouded and you've tagged. If you set it to none, neither of those will show up. If you set it to tag only, then you only see the tag. Cloud and tag shows everything. Numbering per project and per sheet. The majority of projects I've seen have all been per project. I have heard of some instances where projects were contractually obligated to keep track of the number of times specific sheets have been issued. And that gets really confusing, and I think you don't want to do it unless you have to, because what that means is if you make a change relating to one area and it's going to show up as the first change on that sheet, it'll be number 1. But if you're making that same change on another sheet, but there have been other changes there, it may be number 6. So it doesn't coordinate anymore and gets kind of confusing. So here the alphabetic sequence allows you to take out some letters. Really the most common use I've found for this is that it allows you to take out O's and I's so they won't be mistaken for 1s and 0s. And then the row control here lets you move up or move down or merge one issue into another. So there's no way to delete these things. the only way to get rid of something is by merging it into another revision, which you may or may not want to do. I think typically you wouldn't want to do that, because then if you've already issued it, you're going to be adding clouds to a revision that's been issued, and that makes it seem like that was issued with the previous information. So I think if you have one of these things, you may want to just turn it off and show none and retitle it to not used. So now I'm just going to show a quick example of clouding. I've got a sample file here, and let's say I'm going to add a double door to the bedroom. And I want to cloud that. The clouding tool is pretty simple. You just sketch the cloud, and as you're sketching here in the cloud properties, you can set what revision this change is associated with. And this relates back to the checkbox for issued. If the revision has already been issued, you won't be able to set this to a previously issued issue. Once you've placed that, you can still change the issue. That's pretty much all there is to clouds. One thing I'll talk about briefly is that, just like there probably has been for years, discussion, sometimes heated discussion, about whether to cloud in model space or paper space in CAD, there's the same issue in Revit, whether you want to cloud inside the views or inside the sheets. I think there's a pretty good argument for clouding primarily in the views, in that if you have a revision and you cloud it and then you tag it, and then you have a future revision, you want those previous revisions to show up in what you're issuing. So if you were to cloud it in the sheet, they may not necessarily show up, especially if you're duplicating a view with annotations and they're creating it in a sketch format. They wouldn't carry along. But I think the important thing is to establish a strategy and discuss it with your team and remain consistent, because the worst thing is when you have some clouds in views and some in paper space, and it's a mess. You are going to end up with some in paper space if you make any changes to your title block, if you were to, say, change the number of the sheet. So revision tagging, there's just a default tag family that is a triangle. I usually like to edit the family to add a mask in it, so it's going to mask out the cloud. There's not much to it, and I can show an example here of, so this is bulletin number 4, I think. Yeah. You can see if I change bulletin number 4 to be only the tag, it hides the cloud. The cloud is still there, but you don't see it. So sheet revisions and revision schedules. There are several methods for tracking revision milestones and indicating what sheets have been issued at a specific milestone. You can create a revision schedule on a sheet, and basically you're placing a revision schedule in a title block family that will automatically populate with revision information from revision settings. I'm also going to discuss how to issue a full set. So that revision schedule is going to populate when you place a cloud into a sheet. But if you need to issue a full set, you're going to want the revision schedule to show that the sheet has been issued. So there are a couple ways that you can make that happen. In the sheet properties, you can go in and click on an Issue Revisions button and just check that the sheet is being issued for a certain revision. But you can also place a cloud somewhere on the sheet that's in an area that's hidden, and that will populate the revision schedule. It's kind of kludgy, and it's something that you want to talk to your team about before you do it to make sure everybody knows where you're hiding those clouds and why you're doing it. And the primary reason for doing it is that when you do that, you can paste to selected views. So it allows you to very quickly paste to 100 sheets within your set. And that's a lot better than tediously going into every single sheet and checking that the sheet was issued. I'm also going to discuss two different types of revision indices. It's possible to pretty easily create a sheet list to schedule all the sheets within your document, which most people are using to create a sheet index. There are a few parameters available in there that will that come from the revision settings dialog box, and they will allow you to show what is the current revision for each individual sheet. So it's not going to show you a list of every revision and every sheet and when they were issued, but it will show you the most current. If you want to show every sheet, then you can create a revision matrix, and that will show you all the sheets and all the issues. But it's important to point out that as soon as you make that, you're going away from Revit's centralized revision settings dialog box, and you're creating data in two places that can potentially get uncoordinated. So you kind of have to weigh whether or not it's worth that potential risk and whether you can exercise enough control on your team to have the discipline to make all of that information work with each other. So I'm going to go into the title block here, and I've got a revision schedule in here already. And I'm going to edit the family. And you can see in here, this is a revision schedule. If you want to make a new revision schedule, it's under View, Revision Schedule. And within a title block family, that's the only schedule option you have. It's much like any other schedule within Revit. The one difference that you'll find is that there's no ability to filter, and the filtering mechanism is basically the clouds. So things are being filtered based on whether or not there is a cloud on the sheet or through the properties of the sheet. So once you've placed this on your sheet, at Gensler we have kind of a graphic convention where our revisions look something like this, and I think this is kind of a holdover from CAD, so we have to jump through some hoops to try and make this look like something you would see in CAD. And it's kind of a problem to get the text that's populating in the schedule to line up with these individual lines. But you know, if you're happy with a grid that looks like a typical Revit schedule, it's very simple. So now, if I go into this sheet and deselect everything, I get the properties of the sheet, and I can scroll down to this setting down here, revisions on sheet, and this is where you can designate whether or not the sheet has been issued. If I check that cycle 2 permit response, you can see the schedule changed and populated with that. And it came in behind Bulletin 4 because all of this is being sorted by the sequence. So as you can imagine, that gets to be pretty tedious if you have a couple hundred sheets in your set. So a way of doing things a little bit quicker is to place a revision cloud. And it depends on how your title block is designed, but we have these kind of thick lines in our title block, and that gives us a place where we can just put a little piece of a cloud. And let's say I want to issue Bulletin 3, and Bulletin 3 is going to be an entirely full set. So I'm going to set this to Bulletin 3 and apply. And now the schedule is populated with Bulletin 3. And if I copy that and paste aligned to selected views, I can paste it into all of my views. And now I've issued the whole set. And every one of my sheets is now going to have this Bulletin 3 description on it. So I'm going to talk about revision indices now. So here's an example of a revision schedule that is basically a sheet index with a few added columns here that indicate what the most recent revision is for that sheet. So I have a lot of Bulletin 3s, and I think it's because I just pasted it in there. To make one of these, going to go to View. Sorry. Sheet list. Then I'll add a sheet name and number. And then here under, there are a lot of current revision parameters that are built in and associated with the revision settings dialog box. So I can add the revision description and the date and the current revision. And that gives you a schedule just like this. So that's pretty useful. But I know a lot of people want to see a revision matrix. And unfortunately, there's no way to create a revision matrix that draws upon data that's in the revision settings dialog box. And I think this is kind of a throwback to hand-drawn or CAD drawings, where if you had to manually fill this out one by one, it wasn't a big deal because you had to do everything manually in CAD. So if you found that information to be valuable, then you would put the time into doing it. It sort of goes against what a lot of Revit is about in having coordinated information. But if you go to the trouble to create something like this, there are actually some benefits for having issue information set up in a matrix like this. So in order to create this, this is basically, again, another sheet schedule, the same as the one I just created previously. But it's scheduling project parameters that have been associated with sheets. So to show you an example of that, I'm going to add a bulletin 5 here. And I'm doing this in this sequence because you want to be sure that you're adding your sheet issues and revisions in the centralized area in Revit, so that all your clouds and tags are going to be coordinating with this. And then you add parameters that correspond to that sheet issue or revision. So I've added a bulletin 5. I'm now going to add a project parameter. It's going to be a text parameter. And I like to group these under construction. And I'm going to name this similarly to the ones that are already in here. Looks like I already made a bulletin 5. So imagine that I am making this for the first time here. And I want to check the box for the sheets category. Now that's going to add this project parameter to all sheets, and it's going to be an instance parameter. I'm just going to cancel here because I've already got one. And the reason I've titled it in this way is that most projects are going to have a lot of project parameters. It's good to come up with a naming strategy that will group all of your milestone-related issuance parameters all together so you can find them and keep them organized. Yeah, I'm just going to make a bulletin 6. So now if I go into this existing matrix, all I have to do is go to Fields and find that project parameter that I just created and add it to the list of scheduled fields. And then I've got the next column for the next issue. So I'm using a character here, which is basically just a character within Arial font. And there's a tool in here called Character Map. And it's a Windows system tool. And most fonts have a lot of characters in addition to just the letters. So within Arial, you can find some graphic. You could fill your schedule full of happy faces. That would be great. You select it, copy it, and paste it in here. And then once you've put one in, they can just toggle on or off. And you can also assign multiple sheets to have that instance parameter by selecting them in the browser. And then you've got your box showing that this is issued. And then of course I've got some formatting to do to make it look like the other ones. So that's pretty much how you make a revision matrix. Got a question? Yeah, you could. You mean making it a yes/no parameter? Yeah, you could certainly do that. I just prefer to have the flexibility to graphically make it a square. Right. I didn't know that. That sounds interesting. So you can use the yes/no checkbox. One reason why maybe I wouldn't do that is that, well, if you're going to take advantage of this next thing that I'm going to mention, once you've made these project parameters associated with different issuances, you can use them in schedules to address a problem that many of you have probably experienced, in that when you have a schedule and you make a revision to it, if you cloud it and you tag it, that works great when you're issuing that sheet. But what if in the future, say it's a door schedule, you delete 10 doors, your schedule automatically repopulates and everything shifts, and the clouds and the tag is going to stay where it's at. So now you have a tag that's associated with a different door number. It's not even on the schedule anymore. So the way I like to address that is by using these project parameters within schedules to create a revision column within the schedule. And then what you could do is just use text off to the side within a door schedule sheet and call it a little area that says revision items or something like that. You number it, say number 1 is door 237 has been deleted, and then you key in number 1 into that particular issue. So when you make changes in the future, it's always going to stay in that column and stay in the row associated with that door, and you'll have a history of the changes that were made. So in order to do that, to make that happen, all you have to do is go back to project parameters. If I wanted to do that to this bulletin 6, I'd have to modify this and make that parameter available to doors. And then once you've done that, if you have a door schedule made already, and I don't think I do, then basically you'd go into your door schedule, and then that issue parameter would be available, and you could add it as a field. That's right. I suppose in that instance, maybe you could create a door type that exists only in the legend and change it to that type, so it would still populate the schedule, and you call that a not used door. Yeah, I haven't actually had to delete doors and run into that situation, so that's. I don't know. That's a good example. But this technique can also be applied to any schedule, finishes, plumbing fixtures, accessories, and it's a common problem. I sort of wish Autodesk would address it by allowing you to maybe use symbols within schedules, or make some accommodation to allow for revisions within schedules. So I'm going to discuss now methods for creating sketches, and I think I'd like to start by suggesting that depending on the size of the project and the relationship you have with your client and with the owner, I think it would make sense up front to have a discussion about whether or not you want to issue sketches at all. For some of the project teams that I talked to the project team working on the SFO terminal renovation. They had an agreement with the contractor that any changes would be reissued as a full sheet. And that, I think that made their process a lot simpler. And sketches really made a lot of sense when you're hand drawing and you didn't want to redraw the whole sheet, or you didn't want to do different kinds of duplication. You just draw a small sketch format and issue it to the contractor. But in Revit, it becomes just a lot more work to reformat things. So if you can stick to a full-size format, it kind of makes your life easier. But there will obviously be times when different conditions will make you want to issue sketches. So there are several ways you can create sketches. Duplicating views is probably the most common one that people are familiar with. You can duplicate views in 3 different ways. You can duplicate a view, and what that will do will duplicate the view without any annotations. And that's going to be best for creating new views. So if you have you're creating a new view and it's going to have entirely new annotation on it, and it's expressing some aspect of the project that you previously didn't draw at all, duplicating a view will be appropriate for that. You can also duplicate with detailing, and that's going to be a good method for creating a sketch for an area that's already been issued on a full sheet. You can duplicate a view and it'll carry all the annotation with it. And then you can also duplicate as a dependent, and what that does is creates a new view that is linked as a child to a parent view. So plan callouts are another way to create new views, and those are pretty much they're similar to the duplicate view command in that they're typically going to be best for creating new views that have been previously unissued. And one of the advantages there is that it kind of simplifies the formatting. You can window around an area and create a plan callout and make it just kind of proportionally similar to the format of the sketch that you're going to be issuing. You can also create a title block family that has a mask in it, and that's a kind of fast and easy way to create a sketch and then just drop it on top of a full-size sheet. It will mask out the rest of the sheet, and then you can print out just the sketch format. And then you can also use screen capture to grab an area within the Revit model. It seems a little dicey maybe, but if you're doing something that is not really scale dependent, then it's a quick way of getting information out. And you basically would create a blank sketch sheet in like a PDF or DWF format, and then drop the image in. So jump back into Revit. So here's my first floor plan, and it's got a lot of annotation on it. And I've got an example here of a floor plan that was just duplicated, and you can see none of the annotation comes through. If you wanted to drop this onto a sketch sheet, then you just create a new sheet, say an 8.5 by 11. Drop it on there, and then you have to adjust the crop region to get it to fall where you want it on the sheet. So again, this technique is going to be best for a view where you're adding all new annotation, and it's a view that's not already on a sheet. Here's an example of, say I'm making a change to the width of the fireplace on the plan. I've made a duplicate of the plan, and it's carried through the annotation. And again, I'll go through that same process of revising the crop borders, and then I can just create a new sheet. And drop that view onto the sheet. And you can see the way this sketch sheet is set up. It's reading the information within the view and populating with the revision information that's associated with the cloud. So these are just labels within this title block that reference these current revision, description, and date parameters, which are always going to be accessible within title block families. So the last example, duplicating as a dependent. In many ways, duplicating as a dependent is really great, because you can be assured that everything that is within this sketch view is the same as what's in the full-size sheet. And that's something that should be mentioned about duplicating with detailing. It's really important that you have a kind of rigorous process in place for duplicating with detailing, because as soon as you do that, all of the annotation objects that have been duplicated are duplicative. They're no longer coordinated with the main view. So if you make a change in this sketch after that view has been duplicated, and you issue the sketch, and then later you issue the full-size sheet, it's going to really confuse your contractor and kind of screw everything up. So you have to have a rigorous process in place where there's a sequence of events that you always make the changes you're going to make, do all the clouding, and then you place the view onto the sketch sheet. And the only thing that you're doing in the sketch sheet is changing the format, really. You want to try and avoid doing any changes to annotation there. So that's one of the kind of nice things about a dependent view is that a dependent view is still linked to the parent view. So if I go in here and I change this dimension string, if I go back to the overall view, I've changed it in here as well. So it's coordinated with the full-size sheet. And in theory, you don't have to be as careful about changes that you make in the sketch format versus the full-size sheet. In practice, this technique can also cause some problems because in my handout, I list all of the things that dependent views are linked, and there are certain aspects of dependent views where you can make a change, say to visibility graphics. You can change the way that looks, and it won't affect the parent view. But let's say you change the scale in here, and I want to make this much larger for my sketch. Well, I've just done that to my full-size sheet, and then everything is out of whack. So that's another thing to be cognizant of. And I guess that would kind of lead you to think that maybe a plan call-out is a good method, because then you're duplicating a view, essentially. And I've got an example here where on the floor plan, I've created a call-out of the intersection between a couple curtain wall panels. And now that is a new view in a sketch format, and you can dimension this in here, and you're creating a new sketch that is the model elements are still tied to the main model, but you're creating new dimensions in here, but you're probably not going to be in conflict with anything that was originally issued because it's a new view and there wasn't anything in there in the first place. I have seen people use plan callouts to create sketches in areas where there already was information, but then you get into kind of weirdness when what do? Do you copy some of the annotation into that plan callout? It just seems like it's creating an opportunity for error. So the next technique I'm going to discuss is using a title block family with a mask. So let's say I want to issue this change to the fireplace here. I've got a group that is a sketch title, and I basically just drop it in here, and I'm kind of done. It's populating with all of the information from the current revision displayed here, and it has a big rectangle around it that when you make the rectangle, you want to make it at least twice the width and twice the height of your title block for the full-size sheet. And the reason for doing that is that Revit doesn't really have any way of printing by selecting a window. So what this allows you to do is print this sketch sheet. And set this so that you're printing the current window, you are centering it and zooming to 100%, setting it to letter and portrait size. And when you do that, that didn't work. Now it's showing you a scaled 100% view, and since it's set to letter size, it's basically cropping out everything. And since you have the big rectangle around it, you know that it's perfectly centered and it's cropping out the edges of the sketch block. So if you try and create one of these yourself, you'll probably get a headache. I think I probably spent a quarter of the time working on this entire presentation dedicated just to trying to get this to work. I know that it is possible to build this into a single family, but you're going to probably run into problems with draw order. And this is something that I hope eventually Revit will, Autodesk will address this and give us some better control over the draw order within families. Because currently the only way to control how a masking object or a filled region sits on top or below of something is the order in which they're drawn in. So if you have a title block that has already been made, and you, let me just open this up so it's a little more apparent what I'm talking about. So what I ended up doing was making a group, and this group contains a title block family and a generic annotation family. And if I look at that generic annotation family, that's the big rectangle and a filled region. Now, theoretically, you should be able to, and I've seen examples of this that I found on the internet where you create this generic annotation family and load it into the title block family. And we can edit this title block family, and there's not much to it. It's just the same one we looked at before. You can load that generic annotation family in there. But the problem I consistently had was that since I was loading that in last, it obscured all of the line work and all of the labels. And I rebuilt it numerous times. I redrew the whole thing from scratch so that the generic annotation went in first and all the lines went on top of it, and it looked great in the family. And then once I loaded it into the project, again, the filled region was obscuring the line work. And for some reason, a mask doesn't seem to work either. So if I ever figure that out, I will load a good version of that family up to the Autodesk website associated with this lecture. But it seems to work, and you do have some control over the draw order if you create two separate families, a generic annotation and a title block family. When you do that, you can control the draw order. And again, that's controlled by what goes in first. So you drop in the mask and then drop in the title block family, and they'll land in the right order. So this is kind of a fast way of doing this, and it seems to be at odds with the way a lot of people want to manage their sketches within Revit. And I think a lot of people really gravitate towards creating duplicate views with annotation or dependent views because they like to have that record or the history of all the sketches in the project, and they like to have it within Revit. I'm kind of advocating for a technique similar to this because really your record is going to be your PDF or your DWF, and that's a fixed record document that isn't going to change. As soon as you've issued this sketch and you continue to work on your Revit model, you'll be making changes on this, and the sketches kind of move on. They're no longer a good record document. So I don't think there's a really great reason to maintain those in the Revit model because they kind of junk up your file and they create another thing that you have to manage. So I would rather just not do it. So I'm going to show a quick example here of using a screen capture tool. Windows comes with a built-in screen capture tool, and here's a good example of where it would make sense if you had shown an offset on a door. Maybe you have a piece of millwork back here, a piece of loose furniture, and you didn't dimension this, and the contractor wants to know what that dimension is. Well, this isn't really scale dependent. The drawing doesn't have to be to scale, so you can easily copy an image and then drop that into a blank PDF, which is not going to work here because I've just got a copy of Reader on here. But if you had Acrobat Writer or Bluebeam, you can certainly easily do this quickly. So I think that's it with sketches. So systems for item-based revision tracking. Again, this is where this will be departing from standard Revit tools, and there will be areas here where we're creating information that is divorced from the revision settings dialog box. So again, you need to be aware that you're doing that. You're creating an opportunity for uncoordinated information. I'm going to show 3 different ways for tracking individual items. A label integrated into a revision tag, and this is basically using the mark parameter that comes built into a cloud and creating a label to display what's entered into that parameter. And then I'll show how to create a keynote-based revision item tag, and this is using Revit's Keynote system to tag a proxy object and track individual revisions. And then I'll show a symbol-based revision item tag that uses a generic annotation family that just accompanies the revision tag and adds per item information. So here's an example of a revision tag that has an additional label on it that displays an identifier that shows that this is bulletin 3, kind of redundant. I mean, if you're able to coordinate the numbers of your revisions with the sequence of numbering, then it's redundant. But if you're not, and there are many things that can throw that coordination out of whack, what you've done here is provided information that will quickly allow you to look at this and see what change, what bulletin, what addendum, what plan check comment this specific item was related to. So all that's going on here is that I've taken the basic revision triangle and I've added a label, and that label is reading the mark, which is a family category parameter associated with the cloud. So you can see here when I select a cloud, that mark parameter is just an instance parameter. There's also a comment parameter in here, so you can provide a comment that indicates what the change was. So that's kind of great, and that is departing a little bit from the centralized revision tracking area, but not a whole lot. Unfortunately, there's no way to schedule this information. So it's of kind of limited use, and this seems like something I would assume. I don't know why you can't schedule this. This would be helpful, I think. So that's that technique. There is no way to do that with this because it's a system category parameter. I think, let's see, if I wanted to add a there is no ability to create a shared parameter in here that's reading information from the cloud, because the cloud is a Revit specific system. That would be great. That would make life a little easier. So the other method I'm going to describe here is using the Keynote system. And for all of these revision tags, I mean, you graphically can modify them to look any way you want them. I think most people are familiar with a triangle for a change. For reasons I'll go into later, this one I've graphically changed to display as a rectangle. And the way this is working is that there is a proxy object, which is just a generic annotation, a red circle with an instance parameter that lets you change the size of it. And it only exists here to allow you to place a Keynote tag. And the reason that you would have to do this, or you'd want to do this, is that the way Keynotes work is that you can place a user Keynote and associate it with a component, or you can set the Keynote value within a component and place an element Keynote, and it'll display that information that's in the Keynote file. In both of those instances, if you delete the component, the tag goes away. Well, that's not the behavior that you want if you're trying to track revisions and maintain them. So this proxy object, I gave it a visibility parameter so that You can control it globally and basically turn it off by editing the type. And then that turns off all of those proxy objects. That makes it can be hard for somebody who's just getting into the project to understand where they all went. You can also use the detail level to manage the visibility of those things, assuming that you're not using detail levels extensively for other purposes. And where this information is tied to is your Keynote file. And this process can take a little getting used to. I'd recommend, if you're going to edit the Keynote file, that you do it through Excel, because it will preserve all of the formatting that is in this text file. If you try and edit it in a text editor, it's really easy to kind of screw it up so that Revit will start giving you error messages, and the starts kind of screwing up the data in there. So basically, I'm creating parent rows here for each issue, and then I can place individual items in here. And if you have a good idea of like all the changes that you're going to make, this can make managing this information a little bit easier, because you can take advantage of Excel. It's a little bit easier to, say, number your fields. You can quickly renumber these item numbers. So there are some advantages to that. The disadvantages here are that you're stuck using this Keynote file. You're going outside of Revit. Only one person can work on this at a time. And it's a little bit ungainly and difficult to use. And when you save the file in Excel, you'll get like 3 different warnings about the format, and it's basically not going to save any of the format that Excel wants to save it in. You need to kind of dumb it down back to a text file. So really explaining this to people and getting them comfortable with it takes a while. So I've only used this on one project, and I found it kind of useful, but at some point I just abandoned it because it was too complicated. And I know that the John Wayne Airport project I mentioned, they used this extensively. They had a slightly different technique where they'd created a cloud family that was not using Revit's revision cloud, and they tagged the cloud family with the Keynote data. And I guess that was valuable for them because it was such a large project, and they needed to have such granular tracking of information on every item that changed. So the last way of doing this that I'm going to discuss here is a generic annotation symbol. So here's an example of just it's a generic annotation, and I'm basically going to place it next to the revision triangle, and there's not much to it. It's a label that is reading an instance parameter. So you enter in the item tracking number. The nice thing about this technique is that you can add any number of parameters in here. So you've got the item number, you can describe this, you can say what issue it's on, you can manually enter what sheet the revision is occurring on. There's any number of parameters you could add in here. So I'm going to add one really quickly, and let's say I want to add one for cost impact. And this might be something that you want to do if you want to internally keep track of whether or not you assume that there is going to be a cost impact associated with the change. And that would be valuable if you anticipate that the contractor you're working with is going to be creating a change order for everything you do, and or maybe the owner you're working with wants to review every single change. And if you can assess, I don't think there's going to be a change impact to this, then you can group all those changes that you've made into, here are all the ones that should have no cost impact, and we can kind of discuss those and put those off to the side. So that might be something that you want to do. Okay, so that was pretty easy. Now once you've done that, you can schedule all those revision items. So here's a symbol-based revision schedule, and I've grouped them according to what issue they are associated with. And you can see these are RFIs that you may have gotten RFIs, and then you're grouping them together to issue them as an addendum, or maybe you issue them as a bulletin. So what this allows you to do is kind of internally manage the changes that you're making. It's kind of useful here to have a description of what sheets these are occurring on. It allows you, like I've used this before, where I'll put in all my revisions and I don't quite figure out the revision item numbers or the descriptions. I get them all in here, and then I can sort them and order them so that they're going to all occur in order that the sheets occur in. And then you can export this. Let's say I filter this so that the item equals this addendum. Wait, I want the issue to be addendum 1. That limits it to just this issue. And then you can export that schedule and that will export to a text file. And that text file is pretty easy to open in Excel and then drop into a Word format. I think we tend to have a form for a bulletin, and you can drop it in there, and that becomes your narrative. So I think it's useful because it's allowing you to internally manage all the changes. It's organizing it and kind of coordinating it with the narrative that you have to create anyway. It's just, instead of it being in a separate document that you're doing manually, it's putting it into Revit. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to talk about is creating a per sheet item revision log. So this is this relates to using the Keynote style item revision tag, and the one nice thing about using that technique is that you can create a Keynote legend that will schedule the item revision tags, and it will schedule only the ones that are occurring on the sheet. So filtering those revision comments per sheet will happen automatically. You create one schedule, and then you can paste that schedule to all of your sheets, and then you'll have a little schedule on the side of the sheet that makes it easy to see what revisions have occurred on the sheet. Oops. So I've got an area for revision items here that I've just added into the title block. I'm going to make a new Keynote legend. And the only fields you're going to get in here are the key value and the Keynote text. And these two fields are the fields that come from the text file that Revit uses for the Keynote system. And that's really all you can have. So right now, this is scheduling every item revision tag that's been placed in the project. So this is another kind of useful thing that you can have from this. You could put this on a sheet and it would show you revisions throughout the project. Unfortunately, since you can't add any parameters to this, it would be nice if you could, because then you could show what sheet it's on, but really you're just limited to these two. So if you want this, you can duplicate this schedule and then create a schedule that filters per sheet. And in order to do that, the schedule looks essentially like any other schedule. But this filter by sheet checkbox exists here. When you check that, this isn't going to look any different, but if I go to that schedule, which I should stop calling a schedule, it's actually a legend, but it looks a lot like a schedule. And I place that on a sheet. it's not really going to be valuable for the ones that are placed on sheets to have the keynote description on here. So I'm just going to remove that field. And I also don't need to see the title or headers. So I'm really only going to see the tags here. So since there are no tags on this sheet, I'm not seeing anything. But if I paste this to selected views, I can put this in all the sheets in my project. Now if I go to the sheet, I've got this schedule here that is scheduling only the tags that have been placed in this view. Okay, so that is pretty much everything I'm going to cover. So to recap, hopefully you've got an understanding of the basic revision tracking functionality. And my recommendation is that you stick to using that system to track revisions when possible. Try not to overcomplicate things. I think a lot of small and medium-sized projects, you should be able to just enter the information in the revision settings and use clouds and the default tags, and that's going to be enough. And it allows you to put all the data in one place, and that's better. And hopefully also you understand how to track sheet revisions with revision schedules. And I would recommend that you use a revision schedule in your title block. I have seen a lot of, not a lot, but I have seen instances where people are using text, or they're creating families that just have type parameters or instance parameters, and then they're pasted on multiple sheets. And that's really using Revit like it's CAD, and you then manually have to go in and determine how the issuances are sorting, and it can be pretty tedious, and it's easy to get things wrong, I think. And I think a revision matrix is something that you really would want to consider if you've got a medium to large size project. It really gives you a good way of tracking the history of when things were issued, and there are some additional benefits to having that data in the model. I'm hoping that you have an understanding of creating different ways to create sketches. And here I would recommend really the method using a title block family and a mask. It seems to me that that's the simplest way to do it. It keeps your Revit model clean, and you're just relying on fixed PDFs or DWFs to be your record document. And I hope you also understand creating systems for item-based revision tracking. And here I'm going to recommend the annotation symbol. It's a pretty simple method, I think, for adding information to the revision delta. And it's very flexible. I can see, if you have unique circumstances in your project and you need to track things that are not built into Revit's revision system, it's very flexible. It's simple. One thing I didn't mention was it's probably a good idea when you're creating that generic annotation family to create types that are named to correspond to the different issues. Because if you do encounter a point where you need to issue something and you don't want to see tags from a previous issue, you can easily turn off your revision triangles in the revision settings. You can turn the tag off, and that will do that globally throughout the set. But unless you've broken down the generic annotation symbols into different types, you'll only be able to turn everything off, and creating different types will let you selectively turn off tags for different issues. And I hope you also understand how to create a per sheet item revision log. That's pretty straightforward. And again, I think the only reason that you would need to do that is if you're really dealing with an enormous project or one that is really struggling with a lot of change, and there's a reason where you need to minutely track all the changes and have that information in a lot of different formats and in a way that's very clear for the contractor and for the owner to follow. That's all I have, and if you can please provide your feedback, I'd appreciate it. And thanks very much for your patience, and I hope it was helpful.